Hello and welcome to our 10th session on capital structure. Now, for our session overview, let's begin to understand what capital structure is. Now, this is typically the mix of debt and equity that a firm chooses to use to finance its investments, and this is one of the core functions of the financial manager's role. Now, any mix that is employed can have implications one way or the other. So the financial manager's dilemma is to determine if an appropriate mix can be attained for a firm and how to implement that. Now, the capital structure decision typically affects financial risk and hence the value of the company. So the capital structure theory helps us to understand the factors most important in the relationship between capital structure and the value of a company. Now, at the end of the session, students should be able to discuss the various positions in the relevance, irrelevance of capital structure discourse. Now, also be able to explain how the various theories arrive at conclusions on relevance, and then be able to explain the trade-off in the capital structuring discourse. Now, that's how the capital structure decision, based on the development of the theory, beginning with the Modigliani and Miller. Now we look at the irrelevance of capital structure, and then so that's on the both on the relevance and the irrelevance, and then we begin to look at the benefits from tax deductibility of interest, the implications that cost of financial distress may have, any potential agency costs, and then cost of asymmetric information in the discussion as far as capital structure is concerned. Now, let's look at the first proposition from Modigliani and Miller without taxes. Now, according to Modigliani, Franco Modigliani and Merton Miller, capital structure is irrelevant. And for them, the assumptions they make is that the market is perfect. And so, for this reason, investors have homogeneous expectations regarding future cash flows. Bonds and stock markets trade in perfect markets, for which reason that there are no transaction costs. Investors can borrow and lend at the same rate. There are no agency costs, and investment and financing decisions are independent of each other. Now, in that regard, what they presuppose in the layman's terms is that a firm cannot borrow for you in a manner that you cannot borrow for yourself. So whether a firm borrows or not, depending on how it borrows, which cannot be any different from what the individual investor can do, then of course capital structure has no impact on the value of the firm. Now, of course, so in their proposition, the market value of a company is not affected by the type or the kind of capital structure that its firm uses. And of course, I mentioned that it's based on the assumption that there are no taxes, no cost of financial distress, there are no agency costs. So investors will value firms with the same cash flows the same regardless of how they are financed. Now, when it comes to proposition 2, where they add on or do not add taxes immediately, they believe that the cost of equity is a linear function of the debt to equity ratio of a firm. So in essence, because creditors have a claim on income and assets that has preference over equity, the cost of debt will be less than the cost of equity, all things being equal. So as a company uses more debt in its capital structure, the cost of equity increases because debt is given seniority, so the risk becomes more in the equity holdings, thus increasing the cost of equity. However, the weighted average cost of capital remains constant because as more sources of debt, which is considered cheaper, is used, cost of equity increases and it balances out. However, once they introduce taxes to the second proposition, then the dynamics begin to change. Now, taxes provide a tax shield as far as debt usage is concerned. So with the deductibility of interest, then of course the cost of debt is lowered. Now this ends up lowering the weighted average cost of capital as more debt is used. And the tax shield that is gained begins to increase the value of the firm. So by this assumption and analogy, you can increase your capital structure to the point of attaining 99.9% debt, because once you keep on using more debt, benefiting from the deductibility of interest, then it means that you keep on recouping more value from the tax shields generated by that situation, hence favoring the use of debt to the very optimal point. Now, obviously, these raises a few challenges, because in the market is not perfect. There are transaction costs, agency costs, what have you. So that begins to bring in the issue or the introduction of financial distress costs. Now, financial distress costs are the costs that are associated with a company that is having difficulty meeting its obligations. So all things being equal, when firms begin to use more debt, there's a possibility that they will have difficulty in meeting the obligations that arise as a result of the debt usage. Now, the financial distress can come up with these costs. Opportunity costs of not making optimal decisions because firms are confronted with the pending obligations arising from existing debt. Inability to negotiate long-term supply contracts because suppliers may be worried about the ability of the firm to settle on such bills. Now, of course, the expected cost of financial distress increases as the relative use of debt financing increases. Now, once this happens, this expected cost begins to reduce the value of the firm, obviously offsetting in part the benefit from the interest deductibility that we previously discussed. For this reason, the expected cost of distress affects the cost of debt and equity. So the bottom line from this angle says that there is an optimal capital structure at which the value of the firm is maximized and the cost of capital in total is minimized. Now, that typically has to do with the trade-off theory, looking at the value of the firm. And so we look at the market value of the firm. For as long as we begin to borrow and we are making more gains from the tax shields being generated, the firm can continue to borrow. But at the same time, the firm begins to incur financial distress costs. So in incurring the financial distress cost, which is of course has negative implications on the value of the firm, the trade-off point is attained when the benefits from the tax shields are completely offset by the negative implications of the financial distress cost. At that point, the value of the firm that is using debt is believed to be at its peak. Any extra mix beyond or below that point is believed to have not the best or the optimal effects, and so that's the trade-off theory in relation to the value of the firm and how tax shields and financial distress costs relate to each other. So now we begin to look at the possibility of having an optimal capital structure. For the assumptions that believe no taxes and no cost of financial distress, there is no capital structure. But where there are taxes but still no cost of financial distress, firms can employ debt up to the very limit. Of course, that is not attainable, so we now look at the reality on the ground, which is the fact that yes, there are taxes and yes, there are costs of financial distress. And so the benefits of interest deductibility being offset by the expected cost of financial distress will ensure that the optimal point is reached. Now, of course, for any particular firm, you cannot determine what should be the optimal capital structure at any point in time. But then the following needs to be considered in arriving or making a decision. Now, the business risk that the company faces, the tax situation of the company, the degree to which the firm's assets are tangible, the company's corporate governance position, and also the transparency of financial information as regards the company. Now, these are the elements that would obviously affect the position in determining the optimal capital structure for any firm. Now, whilst a firm may have a target capital structure, more often than not, it can deviate from that capital structure due to a number of reasons. One may be that market values of outstanding issues changed constantly, thus always readjusting the company's capital structure position. Now, sometimes market conditions may be more favorable to one type of security over another, hence aligning the firm's capital structure in that direction. Now, in cases where market conditions, in which case it's inadvisable or too expensive to raise capital of a kind, be it debt or equity, you might find companies skewing or moving away from the target capital structure because of these challenges. And also where investment banking fees encourage larger and less frequent issues, you may find firms having capital structures that are quite different from the targets that they may have set out in the very beginning. Now, let's look at some practical issues as far as your capital structure policy is concerned. What may be your debt ratings? Now, of course, the debt ratings we've previously discussed on the bonds could affect your cost of debt capital. Then you may also have to look at other factors, and then you look at leverage within an international setting. Now, when you want to evaluate a firm's capital structure, as an analyst, you may want to consider the following, looking at the capital structure over time. How has it changed and the factors that may influence that? You could also compare that with competitors of similar business risks to see whether the firm in question is towing an appropriate capital structure or not. And then you may also want to consider the company's governance structure, because this plays a very key role in determining whether or not the capital structure is optimal, is appropriate, based on the conditions available. Analysts must also consider the industry in which the company operates, because certain industries are highly leveraged and operate as such, so the capital structure may be more skewed towards debt. The regulatory environments they face, the extent to which the company has tangible assets, as already mentioned, the kind of or the degree of information asymmetry within the market, and also the need for financial flexibility. Of course, these are the factors that could affect the kind of capital structure that a firm may have. So in evaluating the capital structure policy, these are issues worth considering. Now, within an international setting, country-specific factors actually do affect a company's choice of capital structure and the maturity structure within the capital structure. Now, some of the factors to consider are the institutional and legal environment, the financial markets in general, and the banking sector dynamics, as well as macroeconomic factors. Now, these play significant roles in determining or affecting a company's choice of capital structure when it finds itself within an international setting. Now, at the very end of it all, the optimal capital structure is the one that provides the most optimal or the most reduced weighted average cost of capital, which we have already discussed in our previous lessons as capturing the weighted average cost of using the various mixes of capital available to a firm. Now, of course, this WACC is typically the marginal cost of raising additional capital. And so the optimal capital that a firm may seek to have, capital structure the firm may seek to have, would be influenced to a large extent by how it affects its weighted average cost of capital. Now, so summary. Typically, the goal of the capital structure decision is to determine the financial leverage that maximizes the value of the company, or as just previously mentioned, minimizes the weighted average cost of capital. In the Modigliani and Miller theory we developed without taxes, capital structure is irrelevant and has no effect on company value. Now, of course, when we move on to include the deductibility of interest, it lowers the cost of debt and the cost of capital for the company as a whole. So when we incorporate taxes in the Modigliani and Miller proposition, which is the proposition 2, then of course we are looking at the case that the optimal structure is all debt, because then it becomes cheaper. Now, when we begin to consider bankruptcy costs, then a high debt ratio increases the risk of bankruptcy. So using more debt in a company's capital structure would also then begin to have implications. On one hand, when we use more debt in a company's capital structure, we reduce the net agency cost of equity, and that could actually be favorable on one hand, reducing the overall cost of capital. But then the cost of asymmetric information increases as more equity is used versus debt, suggesting that the pecking order theory of leverage, in which case new equity is the least preferred, because it means that as more equity is issued, the cost of information asymmetry increases, meaning that shareholders do not have as much information in this case as managers do, and that could go against them in terms of the pricing. So with a static trade-off capital structure theory, when you're choosing capital structure, the company would balance the value of the tax benefit to the present value of the cost of financial distress. And then at the optimal point where they balance off, that is the point that is considered optimal. Now, in general, as already indicated, when evaluating the company's capital structure, the analyst that you are, you need to look at the capital structure of the company over time, alongside competitors with similar business risk, other company-specific factors that may affect the agency situation of the company. Now, in general, good corporate governance and accounting transparency should lower the net agency cost of equity. And so when comparing capital structures of companies in different countries, analysts must consider a variety of characteristics that differ across them and affect both in a way that will then influence the typical capital structure and the debt maturity structure. Thank you for your time. See you in the next session.